sense. All right, I want to move into, it took me a while to get here, but the topic that I kind of titled this whole thing, which is why NVIDIA's moat is so much bigger than people think. And you hit on this a little bit earlier in terms of them versus competitors. So we talked about, hey, huge demand and huge money going into land grab. And they're building these warehouses. And then what's going inside is like 90% NVIDIA. And I want to talk a little bit about why, first off, why people are choosing NVIDIA, right, over others, and how are they going to maintain that advantage moving into the future?
Yeah, so let's pick that apart real quick. Who are the others? You know,
AMD.
like AMD, right? So
Yeah.
AMD, like, what does AMD fundamentally sell?
Chips.
Oh, okay, but what kind of chips?
They are selling, I mean, they're not selling GPUs as well.
I mean, they are, but like most of AMD's business forever has been selling CPUs.
Right.
Right?
Okay. Yeah. So majority is CPUs, but they're leaning into GPUs pretty hard now, right?
Sure, now and for a few years, I shouldn't discredit them
Okay.
anymore. Like, but AMD's business has always, for a large majority of AMD's life, their
Right.
main competitor was Intel, right?
Right. Tough
And they
scene.
did a, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was saying tough scene, you know, and your main competitor.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And like, to AMD's credit, they fought a long, hard uphill battle against Intel, and they're winning, right? Which is actually a really big feat. I mean, today we all laugh at Intel, but it's not too long ago that Intel was a titan of industry, owned the CPU market, that their x86 architecture is and was everywhere. They were a giant, and they were Goliath, and AMD was David, right? So not to discredit that at all, what AMD has done in the CPU market is incredible. But this is not the CPU market, right? This is the GPU market. And again, what AMD has been able to do in just a few short years, spinning up an enterprise GPU business from essentially zero to where they are today, capturing 2, 3, 4, 5% of the market, is huge. I don't want to discount that.
Yep.
But they are by far the second source compared to NVIDIA, who has been tackling this entire stack for decades now. NVIDIA started as a GPU company. The first thing they ever sold was a GPU. They've been focused on graphics and parallel computing from the beginning, and that's fundamentally what's happening today in AI. Not CPUs, GPUs. So, of course, NVIDIA has a huge lead over AMD. They've been working on this same problem for much, much longer, and they've recruited all the best talent in the world for this very different way of doing computing. I don't think... oh, go ahead.
I want to make sure the audience understands this too, because we're using the high level terminology and you are giving some breakdowns, but just explain to people GPU versus CPU, kind of the massive difference, especially where we're going.
Sure. Sorry. At a high level, a CPU, it's a central processing unit, right? So what does a CPU do? It takes in instructions, it processes those instructions one at a time, maybe a few at a time. You might have heard the term like multi-thread computing. So that's where a CPU can act as like 2 to 4 or, a small number of smaller CPUs doing things in parallel. But largely what a CPU does is it takes instructions in, chunks them up, solves the problem, moves on to the next set of instructions in serial, right? One thing at a time, or a low number of things at a time.
Right.
What a GPU does, GPUs are graphics processing units, but today we really think of them more as like parallel computers. Parallel is the exact opposite of serial. So what parallel does is it takes a problem, it has to be a specific kind of problem, it chunks it up into lots of tiny chunks, solves all of those chunks in parallel, which means at the same time, recombines all those solutions and gives the final output. So it's much faster, but it requires the problem be framed a certain way so that you can break it up into those tiny chunks and put them back together. It turns out that most problems on Earth can be chunked up that way, which is why GPUs have moved from being like specialized for like graphics and AI to being able to kind of do anything, is because we've learned that, that speed up is worth investing, making my problems look like a problem a GPU can chunk up, solve in parallel, put back together, and give you the solution much faster. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And that's where their competitive advantages, like you were saying, having been in it for many years. A lot of people have always kind of had some rough estimates of how far behind AMD is to NVIDIA. Do you have any thoughts on that in terms of the GPU scale?
And again, this is actually to AMD's extreme credit. I think they're like 1.5 generations behind, right? So, and that's actually their biggest downfall, right? Is they're more than one generation behind. So what happens is as soon as they get to only half a generation behind, Nvidia announces their next thing and puts them 1.5 generations behind. So by the problem is these order cycles, the time it takes to stand up a data center, order and get your order fulfilled of all these GPUs, all that stuff has a really long lead time.
Yeah.
So if you know that NVIDIA's just going to announce something even more power efficient around the corner, you're just going to wait because that means you can put in more racks, more compute for the same power and land area, which we spent the whole first part of this podcast talking about. That's the limiting factor. So of course, I'm just going to wait for NVIDIA's next thing because that lets me put 40% more compute, let's say, in this data center, which lets me get 40% more tokens out of the same amount of land and power, which means 40% more revenue or returns on my investment, right?
Tokens are a great thing to discuss here as well. Jensen, I saw him speaking about this a day or two ago, talking about that vertical integration and how it's allowed them to have the cheapest tokens, essentially, if you could speak to that.
Yeah. So long story short, the big thing that's special with Rubin, right, this current generation coming out, is they co-designed 6 separate chips that all work together to make the Rubin platform roughly 10 times more power efficient than the Blackwell platform at the rack level, right? So you take one rack of all the Rubin equipment now, right? So not just GPUs, but there's CPUs in there, there's networking equipment, there's a whole bunch of stuff going on in there. And you just compare it to one rack of the Blackwell generation, it's roughly 10 times more power efficient, right? So 10 times the compute for the same amount of power, or it can solve the same problem in 1/10 the power, whichever way you want to look at it, right? The reason they could do that is because of what you just said, that vertical integration. They own the GPU, they own the CPU, they own the networking technology inside there. They own the networking technology that connects the racks together. They own the network chips that connects all the chips together, so on and so forth. That because they're vertically integrated, because they own all those pieces, they could take them all apart, design them all together at the same time, and put them back together in a way that they all work together to help solve this power efficiency problem. Let's talk about AMD. AMD has amazing CPUs. Nobody's denying that. They have great GPUs. Nobody's denying that. But they run on Ethernet. They don't have anything like a DPU, a data processing unit, which is one of the 6 chips we just talked about. And they rely on other vendors for other specific pieces of their stack, which means they can't take those pieces, rip them apart, figure out how to make them work optimally for their GPUs and CPUs, put them back together, right? So because, I know you guys talk about Tesla a lot. One of Tesla's big advantages is they're fully vertically integrated, right?
Right.
That's the advantage that Nvidia is enjoying in its market versus competitors who rely on other vendors. Just like Tesla's competitors are automakers that have dozens, if not hundreds, if not thousands of vendors and sub-vendors and subcontractors. So there's no way they can optimize every part of their automobile.